Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My apologies for the late start. I take full responsibility for it and have to tell you it was Patrick's fault. No.
I was afraid your laptop had caught fire and burned your house down or something.
No. Actually, so John Tessler, one of our big Axanar volunteers, is flying into town for our volunteer day tomorrow at the studio. And he said, "Oh, I'll be there at 10." I'm like, "Okay, fine. That's good." And then I'll start the stream. And anyway, I'm watching Age of Ultron. My dog is. We now have a puppy that knows how to play fetch and demands it of you. And so I just, between watching Age of Ultron and throwing the ball for the dog, all of a sudden I'm looking down and there's a message from Lissa saying, "Are you up?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. We have a stream, don't we? You guys started without me. You don't really need me. You guys do all the important work anyway." So
we were talking about starting, but we thought we'd give you a chance to catch up. Your audio seems a little off, by the way.
Oh, you know what? Let me plug in my big old microphone.
And while you're doing that, I got a new ID card. I have a new work laptop sitting on my desk. Not a single electronic device has caught fire in my house over the course of the last week. It's been great.
Well, and while you were getting a new computer, I was getting the screen on my Apple was broken, and so I've been using a monitor, but that means I can't take my laptop around the house and use it wherever I want. And I've been avoiding sending it away because I'm like, I don't want to be without my computer for like a week.
Yeah,
that's too much time. So they sent me a box to ship it back to them. And on Wednesday, I was like, okay, I'll ship it out Wednesday night. And when I packed it, I was like, oh, this is an overnight box. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Thursday, I drove up to Charlotte, so I knew I wouldn't need my computer that day. Well, it turns out I ship it out Wednesday night. Thursday morning, I get an email. We've got your computer and we're working on it. I'm like, wow. And then I get another email at like 3 p.m. We finished working and we're sending it back. You'll have it tomorrow morning. So
yeah, that's like, my experience.
Wow, that's service.
Now, the last time I shipped a laptop back to Apple like that was in the 90s, but they sent me a box just like that. I sent it to them. I think I sent it to them at like 10 a.m. and I got it the next evening. I mean, it went to California and back in like 24 hours. It was pretty impressive.
Well, they know you need your computer. It's really, this is what I like. They know you need it, so it's all done by FedEx, and they put it into the price.
Well, and the thing I noticed in that particular case, I sent it back to them, and when it came back, I'm looking at it, and it looked like they had peeled off the sticker for the serial number, and they had put the serial number sticker on like a new computer or something. And I said, okay, did you guys do that? Did you guys just swap out the computer and move the hard drive and that's all and everything else is new? And the response was, no, we swapped your video card too.
Yeah. The last time my screen broke like a year and a half ago. And when it came back, I'm like, they replaced like the A key had totally been, the A key had totally been worn down. They replaced that, and then the little pads on the bottom of the computer that prevent it from sliding around had all come off. They replaced those too. And it's like, they look at your computer and they go, what can we fix on this? I love that about Apple.
I'm glad to hear they're still as good as they used to be.
Yeah. Now they shut down their Apple stores here in Atlanta because of COVID. I mean, I'd gone to right before they shut it down, and they wouldn't let anyone in the store, or they let like 1 or 2 people in the store at a time. Everything was happening outside, and they take your temperature and everything. So, Stephen Ross says, but Chris, exploding electronics is a staple of Star Trek.
I could tell that my equipment wasn't Federation equipment because it did not strew rocks all throughout my.
Yeah, I know. Right? Where the rocks didn't fall from the ceiling? I know.
The rocks. There's a guy named John. A bunch of videos of just all these exploding rocks showing up.
Well, it's better than the string that was on the panel and underneath Spock's station. Back in the original series, there's one scene where they're like, they have to go under Spock's station to fix something, and it looks like there's string on the electron. First of all, there's like vacuum tubes or something. It's just So, well, what are we going to talk about tonight?
Well, so Pat and I did our usual thing of having a conversation on Sunday or Monday and starting to think about stuff for the show. And at some point before that conversation happened, I started thinking about exactly how starship combat works in Star Trek, because there's this tendency to sort of view it like it's a naval thing, but there's a lot of different models of combat. There's lots of different models of naval combat. And I had something that I actually considered to be like a minor epiphany about it. Now, I've had conversations with other people who said basically that they thought I was wrong. But I still think that I'm kind of on to something.
By the way, that's John. I'm going to go, and you just drive the ship.
Okay. So it occurred to me that it's probably worth examining some of the different models of how combat could work, and think about whether those apply to Star Trek. And so I want to emphasize it doesn't mean that Star Trek is somehow wrong if it doesn't follow a particular model. But I think treating these different types of real world combat, historical real world combat, as sort of a metaphor for what the space combat might look like, has the potential to offer some insights. Right? You look at it, you look at the similarities, you look at the differences. If nothing else, it's sort of a shortcut to get to the point of being able to think about, well, okay, if it's like this type of combat in this way, is it like it in other ways also? And so I thought what I do is sort of go through a few of those, with Pat chiming in as he sees fit, and we'll sort of talk about some of those different models. So you can sort of split them into the 3 different modern warfare areas, or the 3, I shouldn't say modern warfare areas because they're not all modern, but all the examples won't be modern, but the 3 different modern warfare areas for the Navy are subsurface, surface, and air combat. You can break it up other ways. You can talk about space, you can talk about cyber and electronic warfare, etc. But I'm really sort of talking about the platform-centered ones. And so let's start with subsurface combat. In subsurface combat, what you have are basically, it's all about stealth. It's all about cloaking devices. The cloaking device the U.S. Navy uses is the ocean. It's all about the detection battle. You're dealing with relatively slow speeds and relatively few weapons. And I don't think that that's really a particularly good model of Star Trek. So I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. There's other sides. Go for it.
You said for the submarines, right?
Yeah, I don't think submarine combat works that well. Now,
well, we'll have to tell the story.
I know what you're going to say. Go ahead.
We'll have to tell Chandler's story someday. Maybe we'll get Chandler and he can tell the story.
Yes, we should get Chandler, and we should have Chandler tell the story. And, okay, so Balance of Terror is clearly based on a submarine movie. There's been other instances where submarine stuff has sort of, that's been the model. But it's been that there's been individual battles in Star Trek that we've seen that sort of seem to work along those lines. But that's not, we don't see fleet engagements that work like that, because really when push comes to shove, fleet engagements is not a submarine thing, right? Back when I was a naval analyst going to sea all the time, one of the big insights that I got from sort of watching it happen is that the real limitation on submarines is that they're inherently solo performers, right? Submarines are at their best when they're operating by themselves, because the communications piece of it is so hard that preventing them from interfering with each other takes so much effort that you end up doing prevention of mutual interference, PMI, by just assigning them separate water space. And so adding submarines to the problem just means that you can cover a larger area. They don't work together. They work next to each other, side by side, covering a larger area. And even then, the surface guys don't like operating in the same water that the submarines are operating in, because it puts all sorts of restrictions on the surface guys at that point. And so that differentiates from like a carrier task force or a carrier strike group or something like that. Surface ships, when they act together, it's really synergistic. It's more than the sum of its parts. So if you've got two surface ships, they can do more than twice as much stuff as one surface ship can. If you double that to 4, they can do more than twice as much as 2 can. Because you're able not only to cover a larger area, but you can have overlapping fields of fire, and you can coordinate, and you can do all these nifty things, and that it's the synergistic effect. It's an exponential effect, increase in capability. Submarines, if anything, 2 submarines is less than the sum of the parts, because you have to buffer them. You can't just butt them right up against each other, because if you do that, then there's always the possibility, because in the real world where weapons might run a little long, the torpedo isn't going to understand that you've drawn a line on a map and it's not allowed to go into the other water. And so it puts restrictions on what one submarine can do if it's right next to another submarine. And, this is all this stuff is pretty intuitively obvious, right? This is all this, if you sort of think about how this stuff all works, that's pretty intuitively obvious. So I don't think that that's a particularly good model of Star Trek combat, because that's not what we see, except in these individual one-on-one type scenarios that first of all, there's basically about 2 of those. And one of them happened in the original series. And I would argue that you can sort of divide Star Trek into 2 things: the original series and the animated series on the one hand, and everything else on the other hand, in terms of like how combat works. So Pat, what do you think about that? Any thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, I think you're right. As far as Star Trek, we see there are 2 sort of submarine model episodes. There's Balance of Terror. There's the Deep Space Nine episode. Somehow I'm blanking on the name of it, but anyways, early Deep Space Nine, and that's fought in a gas giant, which is they're in a different medium than open space. So that's definitely true. And so the thing about submarines, just for everybody, if you have friendly submarines operating with nearby other friendly submarines, they don't have radios. They can't get on the radio and talk to each other to deconflict. And
that's a good point.
People who don't fully appreciate that fact, they don't have a great way to talk to each other without that doesn't give their positions away. And giving your position away is kind of the staying hidden is the only thing that keeps submarines safe for the most part. And the other thing is surface ships don't want to work around friendly submarines, because all they know is that there's a submarine down there if they detect it at all. And we don't want our surface ships shooting at submarines anyways. One particular example, I believe, is in the Falklands War. The British, as I understand it, they fired their surface ships, fired, I believe, every anti-submarine torpedo they had, and I don't believe there was ever an Argentinian sub in the area. So there's lots of false contacts out there and stuff like that too. So it's a very confusing situation and that sort of thing. So anyways, that's about what we got for that.
Yeah, that's a good point, emphasizing that communication piece of it, because I mean, you do have underwater telephones, so you could theoretically do that. But the thing about submarines are eggshells armed with hammers, right? The hard part about killing a submarine is finding it. Once you find it, you poke a hole in it and let the ocean do the rest. And
Yes.
if it wasn't for the fact that ASW is hard, the first time I did a naval exercise, I actually knew I had never been to sea before, unlike one of the guys I was doing this with. But the thing is, I knew more about submarines than he did. And he said, yeah, this ASW stuff is hard. And I said, yeah, if ASW wasn't hard, we wouldn't have submarines. Submarines are incredibly vulnerable. And so in theory, they can talk to each other on the underwater telephone. But the way you find a submarine is you listen for it. So getting on something that's putting noise into the water is not a particularly good plan. And so basically the way it works with submarines is you give them their orders and they go do stuff. And then they pop up a mast and say, all done. And they get on, they stick an antenna up and they talk to you on the radio and say, yeah, we did everything you asked us to. And so, you can bell ring a submarine by sending an alert down, a message down saying for it to come up. You can use VLF or very low frequency, or in the old days, ELF, to sort of tell them to come up to the surface. But in all those instances, it's a one-way communication. And it's a very slow communication. So you're not sending huge amounts of data down there. The one time I saw ELF used before they decommissioned that system, all they did was they had it set up to tell the submarine so that they could send a submarine a message that says the war started. Because that was the hard part. The submarine was in trail and it needed to know the war started so it could take the shot. And so they told them it started, and some amount of time later, not that much time later, it popped up and it said, got him. So that worked out really well. So that's not really a good description for Star Trek combat. It is good for some other science fiction things, like anybody who's seen the old GDW game Star Cruiser. That was part of their 2300 role-playing line. That really is submarines in space. It's really about detection. There's a few other isolated examples where it's about detection.
There's one other. Let me go on.
Okay. But in general, that doesn't necessarily work. I guess there's some other science fiction we've seen, like Glenn Cook's Passage at Arms is really about submarines in space. It's basically Das Boot redone as a science fiction novel, and it's really phenomenal. Wolf packs don't work in this. If you have a set of assumptions that let wolf packs work, then they work fine. If you're doing Star Trek, though, a wolf pack is really just a fleet. Yep. Passage at Arms by Glenn Cook. I believe I bought that book for you, if I remember.
You might have.
Because that's one of the books that if I find copies of it, I'll buy it and give it to people. I've been giving that book away for years. So that's it for the submarine type stuff. For aircraft carrier type combat, you've got World War II aircraft carrier. You can think of an aircraft carrier as a ship that has independent flying weapons. Right, the weapons on an aircraft carrier in terms of being able to hurt other ships are the airplanes. Right, so you can think of it as they're a very special type of missile. And in World War II, you needed to have a lot of them, and they needed to go and sort of drop bombs and torpedoes in order to sink enemy ships. One of the problems I always had, especially with the early Battlestar Galactica, it's not as bad in the second version of it, but in the first version of it, is basically that seems to be a model where you destroy ships by firing 50 caliber machine guns at them. This seems to be an impractical way of destroying ships, just pew-pewing them to death. But that's the only type of weapons we really see. The Cylons, they launch an attack against the fleet, and all they're doing is just shooting them with lasers. Okay.
Well, according to the old Facet game, they all carry torpedoes.
Yeah, but we didn't see anything like that.
No, we never saw that in the show. But according to though, if you looked at the little scanners, when they're little warbook scanners, you would see something like proton torpedo or something on there. And yes, yeah. I know it's the. So, anyways, but there were always just real quick flashes and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see a media property that's been made into a game, because at some point some game designer had to add something to make it work.
Of course.
Yeah, the worst possible thing that you can wish upon an author is to have some game designer decide to make a game on his works, because the game designer will find all of the holes.
Yeah, if you're inventing a new form of combat, you should probably make the game for it so you can be consistent.
Yes, make the game first. So for aircraft carrier stuff, you've got World War II stuff where you're launching strikes with huge amounts of airplanes, and they've got very imprecise weapons, and you're spending a lot of time trying to get through anti-aircraft defenses, etc. Modern air combat is more about precision, or modern aircraft carrier combat is more about airplanes launching precision strike weapons than it is about them, doing things that look like dive bombing. That dive bombing piece stayed surprisingly late. We used to practice to have A6s drop bombs on Russian ships through like the 1980s.
I don't suspect that ever would have gone well for the A6s, but
no, it wouldn't have. But it's sort of interesting as new weapons come into the fleet and old weapons get decommissioned, etc. Every now and then you'll run into this situation where it's like, yeah, we really don't have anything that works outside of the air defense envelope. So we're going to have to like go in and get, we have to take a knife to a gunfight because we're all out of guns. We don't have a gun compared to their gun. And then you go, we need to build a gun, and we build the gun, and it takes a while, but eventually you get that done. So eventually they recover. So neither one of those type of combat really seems to make sense in the Star Trek universe. Star Trek Discovery did have these big carrier strike type stuff.
That didn't happen.
Yeah, it's
better that way.
It's better just to ignore it, because I think.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think we've seen reports that basically indicate that Alex Kurtzman said, well, Star Wars has lots of fighters. Let's have lots of fighters.
Yeah.
Okay.
Assuming they claim to have like 200 of them, as I believe under Captain Pike, the crew of the Enterprise was 200. So you had one person in each little shuttlecraft thingy that they used, or speeder bike thing that they had. I'm not sure. You really wouldn't have had much of a crew on either of the ships. So
yeah,
there were numerous problems with that one. So, and why didn't you make the Enterprise out of the same material that the door was made out of, that Pike stood behind when the torpedo exploded?
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So yes, we could go down that rabbit hole for 20 minutes, but
yeah, I actually got to the point where I had almost gotten to the point where I thought, maybe this is worth watching. And then the last 2 episodes of Discovery hit, and it's like, all right, that makes that easy. I do not need to subscribe to this. I do not need to subscribe to this. So
that was pretty bad.
So then you get to surface combat. And I think you can break surface combat down into basically 4 time periods that could function as a model for science fiction. You've got Age of Sail. You've got pre-Dreadnought mechanical combat, like up until about 1895, 1900 or so. You've got Dreadnought era from like 1905 to 1945, maybe even a little bit later than that. And then you've got modern. And so Age of Sail has really short-range weapons, really poor maneuverability. You just because you're basically it's wherever the wind blows you, right? You're limited to the wind, and it's amazing what you can do in terms of you'd think the wind has to be behind you. It really doesn't. The wind can be coming pretty much from the side, and you can still do stuff with it. But you're really limited to the wind. Lots of strategic mobility. The wind is free, can take you all across the world. Very little tactical mobility. Once steam comes into play, you now have lots of tactical mobility, so you can move around a lot. Early on, you didn't have much strategic mobility because coal, you didn't have a whole lot of coal. You really didn't have the ability to use coal to cross the ocean. So for a while there, you had these really weird ships that had sails and steam engines, and they'd use sails to go across the ocean, but they'd only use their steam engines if they had to fight, which is to modern eyes, modern ears, that sounds really weird. But there is kind of a science fiction equivalent of that. If you've ever played Traveler, where you've got a jump engine that takes you across interstellar distances, and then when you get to your destination, you basically turn the jump engine off and you ignore the fact that you've got it until you need to use it again. And then you've got some other drive that pushes you around the system. So you could have like a really bad jump engine that's really slow, and then a really kick-ass in-system drive, or vice versa. And they're just totally independent. Well, not totally independent. They both take up mass. And so when you're building it, you have to trade off between the two of them. I don't think Age of Sail or that early steam age really makes sense for Star Trek. Then you've got the pre-Dreadnought era and the Dreadnought era. And so the big difference between the two is the Dreadnought era has harder hitting guns, uniform big caliber guns, precision firing. So I'm kind of trying to avoid using the word fire control, although I should probably just use the word fire control, because if you're talking about naval vessels, fire control actually is a specific term of art in this time period. It's not just things like the fact that you can hit something. It's the process that they use, centralized fire control. But we can call it fire control. So it's being able to put a round on target precisely at a long distance. It's sort of characterized by not huge numbers of hits. Basically, you've got armor to protect you when you do get hit, but the hit rate is relatively low. Hit rate during that entire time period was about 3 to 6%. And it stayed 3 to 6% from like 1905 to 1945 for ships firing, for not for like shore bombardment, but for like ships firing at each other. And the reason why that's the case is because they were solving for range in the equation. They weren't solving for hit rate, they were solving for range. They had a tendency to fight their battles at longer range, as long a range as the optics would allow. So like you'd end up with shorter range battles when the weather was really crappy, but then you're dealing with the fact the weather's really crappy and you can't see very well, and as a result your fire control isn't as good. And so that sort of characterizes combat in that time period. In the pre-Dreadnought era, though, you had a lot of really interesting experimentation taking place. There's a lot of really weird ship designs that come out of there. And in part, that's just because, in large part, it's because we don't know what the right answer is. We're going to try everything and see if it works. So they tried lots of different answers. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. One of the things they really talked about, though, as a possibility was just using quick firing guns to whittle the other guy to death. And so the idea is that relatively small caliber guns could fire a lot. You could actually have a greater a greater weight of shell over a given time period with quick firing guns than you could with big guns, because they just fired so much faster, and you could have so many more of them because they were so much lighter. So they fired a shell that was about 8 times the size, 1/8 the size. They could have 8 times as many guns for the same amount of weight, and they could fire 8 times as fast. When you do all the math, it's like you can get a lot more weight of shell out.
You should talk briefly, at least, about the penetration, where
Yeah.
a gun will probably penetrate 4 inches of armor, and roughly the amount of armor they had. So the fact that you could slough off light, if you were well armored, you could slough off those light caliber shells, even though you got hit a greater amount of them.
Yeah, and that's really one of the interesting things about it in this time period is that you could, if you armored the entire ship, you could basically prevent that light stuff from causing too many problems. Not totally, and I'll get into that in a second. But then you're leaving yourself open for, if a big gun manages to hit you, hitting is hard, because all the stuff that they came up with to allow hitting to happen on a regular basis was really sort of the thing that came in with HMS Dreadnought. The Dreadnought Revolution was really about combining centralized fire control. So all the guns are shooting at the same target. You've got a central computer that's telling them where to fire. Continuous aim. So you've got the barrel continuously points at the target as the ship is rolling. It used to be that you'd have to wait for the gun barrel to, as the ship rolled, you'd wait for the gun barrel to come down, and just as it's pointing at the target, you'd have to quickly pull the lanyard and fire the gun. Okay, that doesn't work very well. Instead, what you want is continuous aim, so it's auto-stabilized, so when you point the gun in a particular direction as the ship rolls, the barrel stays pointed at the target. Salvo firing, you fire all the guns at once. You have a uniform armament so that you can tell about shell splashes. Shell splashes are the information, that's how they correct their fire. So if they're all the same size armament, okay, my guns I need to pull back a little bit, I need to extend a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. You're generally dealing with range problems. Getting the bearings usually pretty good, unless both ships are doing turns at the time. But you're trying to keep the trying to solve for the range, and that's kind of the hard part. And so when you sort of add all that stuff up, the possibility of hitting with a big gun goes up a lot. So if you armor your ship to deal with all the little crap, the big stuff is just going to cut right through you. If you armor the ship to deal with the big crap, you can't armor everything. You kind of have to make decisions about how to do it. And so we ended up with a lot of ships that had an armored citadel. You'd armor the parts that you really needed. So like the boilers and the magazines and the fire control and stuff like that. And, if the wardroom gets blown away, sucks to be you. You'll just have to deal with that. Now, that having been said, there was a school of thought that said even if you've got armor spread out throughout the ship, enough quick-firing guns could really do a number on it, right? The bridge, you can't really armor the bridge very well because you've got guys standing in the open. This is even in the days before windows, really. The guy who's controlling the wheel, the captain, etc., are standing out in the open, rain or shine, snow, blizzard, Atlantic storm. They're outdoors controlling the ship. There's a lot of other stuff you can't armor, like you can't really armor the funnels. And that's a bigger deal than you might think, because anybody who's got a fireplace understands how important it is for your chimney to be working, because there's actually a physical effect of a draft that pulls the exhaust gases up and pulls air through the part that's on fire and makes that more efficient. So basically, if you shoot an enemy smokestack enough times, his ship gets slower because he can't generate as much heat for his steam plant. And so there's all sorts of things that you can just screw up. And a lot of those guns in the early days were people, they weren't necessarily turreted. And, the turrets have holes in them for the guns to poke through. So there's lots of places you could shoot with these quick firing guns that you could conceivably make a ship combat ineffective without ever having a big explosion, big shell penetrate and cause a big boom. You could just whittle them to death. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that I think that that's the model that best represents Star Trek combat. And that's because, if you think about it, usually what ends up happening in Star Trek combat is most shots fired hit a shield. They may or may not do any damage, but over a period of time, you sort of build up damage to the shields.
It does throw rocks into the bridge, but yeah.
Yeah, and rocks fall throughout the bridge, and the gelato machine explodes and all sorts of other stuff. You've got and you sort of whittle it down until you get to the point where you start doing critical damage because you've whittled it down enough. It's not a perfect analogy because you do have things like the initial shot that takes out the warp drive, and so now the Shinzon or whatever his name is can just plink away at the Enterprise for a while. You do have things like that. That doesn't really have an analogy to it other than maybe just a lucky hit. They spend a lot more time calling shots than any naval force historically ever really did. But I've really sort of thinking about it, I've kind of come to the conclusion that pre-Dreadnought is the model, not Dreadnought combat. I've never heard anybody say that before. So I don't know that anybody else has ever come up with that idea. And it's certainly not modern surface combat where you've got lots of missiles. You're not firing you don't fire lots of rounds, but every round is a precision weapon. And even photon torpedoes, photon torpedoes are guided, but I don't remember seeing anything maybe it's there, Pat will tell me if I'm wrong, in a Star Trek episode where basically they fire photon torpedoes out 90 degrees in each direction, and then they do a time on target attack on the ship they're firing at. No. These photon torpedoes seem to be a little bit better than, say, like World War II submarine torpedoes, in that what you're really talking about, you shoot it in one direction and it can kind of curve right or it can kind of curve left.
Yeah, I think you generally shoot it in the direction of the target, and then it probably fine-tunes itself, and it hits or misses, depends on the maneuvering and electronic warfare, all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
it's
but you're right.
Yeah, it's kind of like an old infrared air-to-air missile, in that you have to be pointed right at the target within pretty narrow parameters, and you fire it, and if everything works out, it's able to sort of steer its way there.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for shields. I wouldn't say they're totally useless, because of course we only see instances where they happen. And I'm reminded of what a friend of mine who's a science fiction author said about ships in his universe. He said, if you've lost your shields, you're in a pre-plasma state. But shields. The way shields work are really convenient. First of all, for in the original series, because they didn't have to deal with showing damage. It's like there is no damage until the damage destroys you, right? So from a special effects standpoint, that's great. I don't have to cut the pictures of the ship, and I'm constantly monkeying with the model to add damage. I don't have to do any of that stuff.
Yeah.
So from that standpoint, it works really well. And, it's just, you never have to worry about it until it's totally gone, basically, usually. So Alec, any thoughts on any of that?
Well, in one sense, it's almost, it's an interesting argument, because really what we're saying is the people who are writing our space combat, where are they drawing their inspiration from? That's really what we're kind of talking about, because outside of maybe David Weber and his series and some other science fiction writers, But basically, Star Trek isn't thinking about that.
No, and I would not argue that they are doing that. I didn't mean to suggest that I think that they're doing that. It's more along the lines of when I try to wrap my head around what's happening. Where's the place where I can draw an analogy and use the power of that analogy to ask other questions and learn things by seeing how it's similar and how it's different. Maybe Sternbach might have done something like that. Sternbach and Okuda.
Yeah. Well, and obviously, you wouldn't want modern naval combat to be the model, because it's a sea skimming or supersonic missile comes in, it hits the ship, and the ship explodes, or is on fire and completely crippled. So, modern ships, they pretty much are knocked offline by a very small amount of damage. So, for the show, obviously, you need to have bits of escalating damage and getting whittled down, so to speak, as your shields get degraded a little bit and more panels explode on the bridge and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I certainly don't think they were going through history trying to find the model. I think we're matching the model, or Chris is matching the model to what we see on screen. So,
yeah, I think if it might be the case that they're reading a bunch of naval history along the way, and sort of some of them are reading it and thinking about it, but I don't think it's at the point of like they might be seeing things that they like and pull it in. This is the way that a lot of authors do it. They see things that they like and they pull that in.
Pieces of multiple things.
But they don't necessarily sort of sit down and do a complete breakdown of all the different pieces of it.
Yeah. So one of the analogies that also could work, and they use this in one of the games, is the analogy they use is that imagine World War II bombers are fighting each other with all their turrets and stuff like that. They're kind of plinking away until you hit something real important. They're just kind of plinking away, but they're maneuvering very fast, and they're relatively fast compared to the range of their weapons. So they're coming in. So just imagine no one ever thought of fighters. We just keep building bigger and bigger airplanes and putting 50 caliber turrets or 20 millimeter cannons all over them. And that's what we have for air combat. So that would be another potential analogy for.
And when we talked about that the other day, when you mentioned that, I have to say, I would totally buy a game
I would buy
entirely based on like the enemy B-17s are coming in to do strategic bombing, and I send up my B-25s to shoot at them from the turret. I would totally and completely buy that game. I think that game would be fantastic.
A slightly alternative history where no one thought of the fighter. Or that air-to-air gunnery from turrets was easier than it actually is. But if you think about shooting a 50 caliber gun at a moving airplane, your plane's going, you're firing the gun sideways, so relative to you, the bullets are traveling in some weird direction. Planes traveling in a totally different direction, doing maneuvers. That's a challenging thing. I think there's a reason they put tracers on those bullets. So.
Yeah. And the thing is, most people don't understand that a World War II fighter has, like, maybe, depending upon the fighter, you might have 25 or 30 seconds of ammunition.
Yeah, it's not much. No.
Yeah, I mean, the P-47 I think had the deepest magazines, and it wasn't much more than that. I want to say the P-51 was 25 seconds, and so
P-47 had 8 50 cals on it too.
Was it 8 or was it 6?
The standard was pretty 6, but I think they had 8 on the P. I could be wrong about that.
No, you might very well be right. I watched something on the P-47 not too long ago, and one of the things they talked about is how they had such big magazines, and they had.
And that was a big airplane.
Yeah, that was a monster of an airplane. A real monster of an airplane. I'm currently reading a book called Spacecraft of the First World War. And it's based upon the premise that in 1902, the Martians invaded the Earth and died because they caught the flu and left all this tech around. And so we all reverse engineered the technology. And so then we went back to Mars and discovered that they were pretty much in the process of dying out on Mars too. So that wasn't really a big deal. But now we've got all this tech around. And so we end up, there ends up being a world war that involves us with basically cast iron spacecraft. Well, there is steel, but, and it's very entertaining. It's very entertaining. So I haven't had the ability to look at very much into the comments to see if there's any questions in there.
What was I gonna say?
Yeah, there's a comment about the battle off Samar. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yep.
Dave, did you see that? Here, I'll post it. Do you see?
Somebody was asking about the literal combat ship, and yeah, that. Let's see. No, I haven't read that series. I haven't not read that series. I should. There was a comment about the literal combat ship, which reminds me of something I was told. That's a classic example of the Navy has a failure mode. Nothing I say represents the official opinion of any employer, past, present, or future. The Navy has a failure mode that I got to observe on many different occasions, which is they will adopt the conclusion slide of the presentation while explicitly rejecting the assumption slide. I've seen them do that on multiple occasions. And so LCS is a classic example of that they decided they were going to, the chief of naval operations at the time wanted to build this ship. There was this argument in favor of something called Street Fighter that would be a small ship, etc. And basically Street Fighter was based upon a bunch of different assumptions, and then they proceeded to reject the assumption slide and adopt the conclusion slide. And the assumption slide was like, if you do all this stuff, you can build this ship really cheaply. But they rejected all those. And so it ends up being the ship that was supposed to be 150 or 200 million a copy ends up being like 600 million a copy, 600, 700, whatever million a copy. And as a result, and plus they weren't able to make it do all the things they wanted it to do. So it does a lot less for about 4 times the price.
Isn't that like the Bradley fighting vehicle? The same, right? Wasn't the Bradley fighting vehicle just like a disaster?
Yeah. So it's nowhere near as bad as Pentagon Wars would make you believe. Pentagon, what are you doing, buddy? Pentagon Wars would make you believe that the Bradley is a total and complete disaster. But the Bradley's been tested in combat and it did pretty well.
Yeah.
And it did suffer from, as I understand it, from some serious mission creep.
Yeah.
But there have been some great systems that had mission creep, and in the end, they are able to make it work. The C-17 is a great example of that. C-17 was originally intended to be a transport aircraft as an intra-theater lift aircraft, right? So the idea is that you're fighting in NATO, and you need to move a bunch of forces, just not real far. You just need to move them like 400 miles.
Right.
And so it was originally designed to be high capacity, relatively short range. And then somebody said, we want to make it transoceanic.
Oh.
And at the time, there were all these people saying that this is a total and complete disaster. Total and complete disaster, we're wasting all this money, etc. The C-17 is an awesome airplane. Mm-hmm. They were able to do it. They made it into a transoceanic.
Oh, okay.
A reasonably short takeoff capability. Fantastic capability. The biggest problem we have with the C-17 is they didn't build enough of them, and they've been rode hard and put away wet because they've gotten way more flying hours on them because they're so useful. They've put way more time on those platforms than they ever really expected to by this point in their lifespan. And, the production line is cold. And that's you'd think, we've already built these before. Why can't we just flip the switch and build some more? And the answer is once the production line goes cold, and, the last time we built any of these things was 10 plus years ago.
Right.
Yeah. New tech takes time to work, and Zumwalt is an interesting example. One of the problems with Zumwalt is it's another instance as you build fewer of them, they get more expensive, and as a result, you start cutting costs and you start cutting capabilities that were the reason why you wanted to build it to begin with. So Zumwalt was supposed to have a really kick-ass, higher caliber gun that they concluded was going to be too expensive because they were never going to buy enough ammunition to drive the ammunition price down.
Oh my God.
Same thing happened with F-22. The sunk cost part of it, the marginal cost of the F-22 was actually not very high. The marginal cost, the cost to buy the next one was not particularly high, but the development cost had driven if you just divided by the total cost, it looked astronomical. So they cut the buy. For another $10 billion, you could have doubled that buy. And I forget how many multiples of 10 billion they'd already spent. But you could have done, 10 billion sounds like a lot, but that's a fantastic airplane. And they could have just doubled the buy.
Wow.
And they didn't. So now we've got a very small F-22 fleet.
Mm-hmm. It was, and the F-22. The F-22 was being developed at the same time as the F-35, wasn't it?
Yeah, F-22 started first, but they always sort of they'd come up with the F-15 and the F-16, they'd come up with the high-low mix idea. And they sort of wanted to replicate that because one of the things is F-22 was going to be a pure air-to-air platform, like the F-15 originally was.
Right.
And the thing with the F-15 was not a pound for air-to-ground. And so that was the same idea with the F-22, and then you'd have the F-35 to take over the strike role. So F-22 replaces F-15, F-35 replaces F-16.
Gotcha.
And it would be incorrect to think of the F-35 as simply a poor man's F-22. I used to think of it that way, and then I got a briefing from the deputy program manager on it and all the different capabilities it had, and it is fantastic in terms of some of the capabilities it has. And the coolest things about both those jets are the things that take place inside the cockpit. In terms of the battle management and situational awareness and low probability of intercept communications and all those things. I'm a big believer that air-to-air combat should be. I want the situation that Air Force and Navy aviators end up to be the functional equivalent of clubbing baby seals. So F-22 and F-35 both fit in the category of the first that the bad guys know that they're in trouble is when they hear the bang.
Well, so I did have a first officer who was a retired colonel, Air Force colonel, and I do remember him telling me, no, the F-22 is a really cool plane. We'll have a pair of them take on 8 F-15s, and then the 8 F-15s will all be dead before they even knew that the battle had started. So
yeah,
wow.
So
yeah.
problem is they still have to land.
Yes.
They still have to land eventually.
And in some theaters they've got more capability than others. I mean, the range, those are basically airplanes designed to fight in Europe, where you're not crossing 8,000 miles of oceans to get any place. When you start talking about island bases and how far you have to go and then how far you have to come back, range is a big deal. And when you're dealing with something like an F-15, you just hang external fuel tanks on it. And there's some trade-off, but you can hang a bunch of stuff on the outside, which you really can't do for stealth aircraft and maintain their stealthy capabilities. which is one of the reasons why they've sort of talked about for the F-35 that the plan is that they, early on when they're basically taking down the air defense grid, everything is stowed internally, but later on they might hang stuff off the wings. There's provisions to hang stuff off the wings when it becomes less important for it to be that stealthy. Mm-hmm. So they're both fantastic platforms, though. And I've got I haven't seen a production model F-35 in the flesh. I've seen the prototypes. I haven't seen the production model, so I haven't seen one that's actually been moving. I've seen F-22s a couple of times. So there's a comment about F-35s and dogfighting. It's not clear to me how good they are at dogfighting at this point. There were some early tests that indicated there were some problems, but they were early tests. I've heard something, read something recently on the news to the effect of that stuff was largely fixed with software fixes. And the other thing is that if you've got dogfighting, if you're in a dogfight, that's oftentimes an indication that other things have already gone wrong. I think the beyond visual range part of the fight is more interesting. And if you're in a stealthy aircraft and you're at the point where you're dogfighting, it's like, how did you get there to begin with? You shouldn't be in a dogfight.
Well, I think it can still happen. I've talked to some people about the modern missiles, and they're not quite the perfection that we all hope that they are.
That's true, but they're pretty good. Sure. It's not like we've got a whole lot of gun ammo to begin with.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that what everybody would want to have is 10,000 rounds of gun ammo and 8 Sidewinders and 8 AMRAAMs. And while we're at it, let's make the airplane cost $150.
Right. Right. Yep.
But and in some missions you need a gun. Like the one reason why the Marines wanted a gun is because they want to be able to shoot at ground targets.
Yeah.
And okay, I understand that strafing is potentially useful under some situations. I have a tendency to discount the utility of the gun in an air-to-air situation, though, just because I think you're probably better off shooting a missile, and you don't get the gun for free. You've paid a weight for
it. But I think the Arab-Israeli conflict, as I understand it, most of the missiles would miss, but in their evasion of the missile, you could cut the corner and hit them with the gun. And I believe the Israelis did that quite a bit. But that's 20, 30 years ago. So I understand that they're better.
No, it's not 30 years ago. It's closer to 50. Think about it. The 73 war.
In 70s and 80s.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's actually a comment I've made when people start talking about Vietnam. It's like, look, I'll make a deal with you. I'll grant you the point if you can give me an example that isn't at least 40 years old.
Yeah.
Right. Because two things really changed after Vietnam from an air-to-air missile standpoint. One is that the missiles just have gotten a lot better. And secondly, we got a much better idea of how we could abuse them, what the impact of abusing the weapons were.
And how to maintain them.
Yeah, and how to maintain them, because these things are complicated machines. These aren't what they refer to in the military as wooden rounds, which means you basically, that it's like you don't do maintenance on ammunition for your pistol, right? It just is. And you put it into your Beretta, and now you can fire it, right? These aren't rounds like that. These are complicated machines, and they need maintenance, and just sitting around will cause them, every now and then you need to tune them up in the same way that if you put your car in a garage and leave it there for 2 years, you're going to have to do some maintenance on your car. Yeah, except the gun doesn't get you a whole lot anyway. I mean, the gun has a little bit of utility. I just don't think the gun gives you a lot of utility. And one of the things that we learned is that you couldn't just leave the missiles. I'm sorry, Pat, you were all distorted. Say that again. Oh, we maybe
froze.
All right, Pat, you've frozen. If you can hear us, you need to sort of restart or something.
Why does Pat always have shitty connections?
I don't know, and he's home. His connection should be fine.
I know. Come on, Pat, get a gigabyte.
Yeah, the internet is suddenly.
You're still coming through really distorted. So while you're taking care of that, let me finish the thought I was going to have, which is that one of the things that the Navy discovered is that you can't just put a missile on an airplane, shoot it off the front end, land it on the back end, and just like do that 5 times without exchanging the missiles, because you end up then when you go to actually fire the missile, you pull the trigger and the missile falls off the airplane into the jungle, because they're just not designed to take that abuse. And so they learned that every time the airplane lands, you have to strip off all the missiles and put new missiles on it, and take them down below and do maintenance on them.
Wow, interesting.
So, and those were, the missiles in Vietnam were second generation air-to-air missiles, basically, if you count sort of the World War II era stuff as being 0 generation. So they were second generation air-to-air missiles, and they weren't particularly good. The new stuff is a lot better. It just is. Still not perfect, but when was the last time anybody actually had a gun kill? How many gun kills did we have in Desert Storm? As I remember. Yeah, air to air. As I remember,
did they ever get any aircraft into the air?
Well, an A-10 had a gun kill
of another plane.
I believe an A-10 shot down a helicopter.
Oh, okay.
And they also, I think, dropped a bomb on a helicopter, if I remember correctly. But I think they also had a gun kill.
Yeah, I don't remember a lot of planes getting off the ground in Desert Storm.
But there were some. There were some, and we shot them down with missiles.
What were remember back in the 80s when we shot down 2 Libyan MiG-21s?
Yeah, those were Su-22s.
Su-22s, okay.
Yep. It's I don't know. It's a very early fighter. I mean, it was totally outclassed. So
yeah, it was totally outclassed.
It was near suicide.
Yeah. All right. Well, we that's the hour. I hope everyone enjoyed hearing Chris pontificate about the history of naval combat, because I love it. I'll just sit here all day and let Chris talk about it. I learned so much. But by the way, when we were talking about aircraft and mission creep in the reverse, the B-1 bomber, another one that was as things went. It just things kept changing on that one, and I love that plane, man. And they still use it, right?
Yeah, they do. Although they're these days their availability rates are pretty low because they've been rode hard and put away wet. Last I heard, the availability rates were lower than they wanted them to be.
Oh,
because we've used it a lot.
The Air Force's the United States Air Force's inventory. A lot of their airplanes are very old. I mean, think about the B-52 from the 50s. We're still flying those. We put new engines on them. The B-1s from Reagan era, so 80s. I'm not sure exactly when they came out.
Yeah.
So we've got the stealth bomber, and I don't know. We've got 5 of them.
More than that, but
I think it's 100. I think we have 100. Isn't it?
No, it's not that many. It's not that many. Okay. Yeah, it's like 20 something, if I remember correctly. A coworker of mine, I was working at the Center for Naval Analysis when he said this. He made the comment. He said these things are so expensive that the Air Force is going to name them after states, like battleships. And then they did.
Really?
Yeah, each B-2 is named. And they're like Spirit of Kansas, Spirit of Missouri, Spirit of Arizona.
Huh.
So, yeah, they named them after states.
Wow. Well, that means there's no more than 50.
They're about as expensive as a ship, so they might as well name them.
Yeah, the Air Force realized, they'd achieved their goal of having platforms that were as expensive as aircraft carriers with some of the satellites. But then they decided they wanted a manned platform that was as expensive as an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, so I think there was that B-2 that crashed. So that was like someone crashed half of an aircraft carrier, I think.
Oof.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, and there's a YouTube video on why that crashed, and I don't remember all the details, but it was just like somebody did something really stupid.
Mm-hmm.
They like didn't calibrate their test equipment for the environment they were in, and so when they did, it was they didn't calibrate the equipment that they use. Thanks, Jeff. They didn't calibrate the equipment that they used to determine that they used to test the airspeed equipment on the airplane. And so as a result of that, when they tested the airspeed indicator, the airspeed indicator was giving them false readings, and they were going way slower than they thought they were, which, Pat, is it a good thing to be going slower than you think you are when you're trying to take off?
It absolutely isn't. In a jet airplane, it is hard to tell. It can be difficult to tell just by sound and stuff like that as how fast you're going. No, we actually train for that and unreliable airspeed. As a matter of fact, I'll be training some people on that very problem tomorrow morning. So, where your airspeed, and if your instruments stop work, you're taught as a pilot to trust your instruments. So when they stop working, you've got to let's see, what's the word? Well, anyways, you've got to get over the fact, you've got to like put together the fact that things aren't making sense, and then isolate it down to figure out which instrument's not working. So it's a challenging thing for people. So
yeah,
it's not like a flag necessarily comes up and says, this thing's not working. It's you have conflicting bits of information to different bits of instruments and stuff, and that can cause problems. And some of that feeds computers that do things automatically too. I don't know anything about the avionics on a B-2, so
and
it's a really complex problem.
That what you just described sounds a lot like how submarine combat works. Now, I have never been at sea on a submarine, but I have talked with people that have watched this happen. And he said that as they're working the problem, because one of the things about submarine combat is you're getting directional, it's all passive information. So it's not like radar where it gives you a range and bearing. You're getting bearing information, and you don't know the range, and you maneuver, and your target's maneuvering, and you're basically constantly coming up with hypotheses as where he might be that would be consistent with the information you're getting, right? So you're plotting it all out, and it's like, okay, if the contact moved like this, what must be true for that to happen? And so the friend of mine that was watching this take place, the captain the entire time is so he gets a piece of information from one of the people that has information, and then he'll turn to somebody else in the control center and say, what are you seeing? And that person will give him a piece of information, and he thinks about it. Okay, what are you seeing? And he's coming up with hypotheses in his head about what is working and what isn't working, and what would have to be true, and how can I determine whether this hypothesis is correct? Which person with which sensor can tell me the information I need to be able to winnow it down? And it sounds to me, Pat, like that's kind of the same situation when you're troubleshooting your instruments. It's like, what has to be true for me to be getting this?
Yeah, well, hopefully you hope it's one instrument that's failing, and then so the other ones will finally give you the information, which is why you scan multiple instruments so you don't get bore-sighted on one thing, ideally. But I believe Alex was trying to wrap this up, so I will stop.
Keep you guys out of here. Get out of my house. Well, all right. Listen, thank you, everyone. Next week, Two Geek Girls is going to be moving to Sundays, so we won't be having. We do have an Axanar After Dark tomorrow, but it'll be the last Sunday one. After that, we will not have a Sunday Axanar stream. It'll just be Two Geek Girls. So stay tuned. Stay tuned. That will be coming out with the schedule this week. As soon as Alexander can put it together, I sent it over to him. He's like, I'm off for the weekend. So we'll have that schedule published. But we'll see you tomorrow. We had a great show last night on Blade of Honor, and hopefully you'll go back and check that out if you haven't seen it already.
That was
it was it. I mean, we could have this whole conversation about the space combat in Blade of Honor. And please do check out our Kickstarter. Just look for Axanar on Kickstarter, where we have the MSD posters. We crossed $3,000 today, so we funded it, and we're halfway to our stretch goal. So please check that out. So anyway, Chris Weed, Pat Doyle, thank you once again for an engaging and interesting night talking about space combat, or space combat in the age of sail, and or in the pre-net dreadnought age. And we will see you next week. I think I sent both these guys a little graphic about warp speed. Maybe at some time we can have a little conversation with everyone about what warp speed is, since it seems to always change.
That sounds good.
Yeah,
I'm going to go through the comments and post some. I'll go through the chat and post some responses and comments probably tomorrow. I did that on last week's episode too. I try to do that each week. So.
Yeah, there was talk about battleships and why we don't use battleships and stuff like that. So you can probably explain that one pretty easily post World War II. So
very good. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great week. Please stay safe, stay healthy, be smart, and wear your damn mask. And we'll see you guys next Saturday.
All right.
As always, live long and prosper, everyone. Cheers.